G'day guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Kaitlyn and I'm an American living in beautiful Sydney, Australia. So as I mentioned a couple times on this channel, I used to be a paralegal over in the States. I was a senior paralegal for a law firm over in Philly before I moved over here. And I'm not in the legal field over here in Australia, and to be honest, I do really miss it. I loved working in the legal field. I definitely don't want to be a solicitor, but I did love working as a paralegal. And one of the things that I do just to sort of see what's going on over in the States is watch the channel Legal Eagle over here on YouTube. His channel is so good. It's so well done. It's very, very informative. And it does also keep me a little bit updated with what's going on with America's politics, the American legal system. I feel like I learned something new every single time I watch one of his videos. They're so well done. They're so well produced. So to be honest, I've only ever worked in the personal injury space. There were 3 areas of law that absolutely fascinated me and I would have loved to work in, still would if I ever get the chance. Maritime law, military law, and international law. The 3 of those are fascinating. Some of them are a little bit complex and a little bit tricky to deal with. And this video from Legal Eagle, pirate law is a real thing. I wanted to know what this was referring to. It does look like they are actually talking about like pirate law, maritime law, and whatnot over in the States. I don't really know what to expect. I don't know much about maritime law. Would have loved to actually get into that, but didn't have the chance to. It never really came up. I'd love to while I'm over here. No idea if that'll ever actually happen. But let's see what this video has to say. Let's see what Devin has to say. Grab a bicky, grab a cuppa, and let's get right into this video.
Today we're talking about maritime law, which is why I'm standing next to my yacht, the Legal Seagull. Wait, where did he go? Damn you, pirates! Ahoy, Legal Eagles! Today we're talking about pirates, specifically sea pirates, and the law of the sea. Because believe it or not, pirates actually had a huge effect on not only the founding of our country, but also the way that our laws were shaped, both domestically and internationally. So let's talk about what it means to be a pirate and why that's incredibly illegal. So first we need to talk about what laws govern the ocean. And there's actually 3 overlapping types of law. First, there's maritime law, which is generally the law related to private ships and commercial shipping. And then there's admiralty law, which generally relates to the law of shipping, whether it's navigable waters, in rivers, or on the ocean itself. And then there's the law of the sea, which is an actual thing. That is the international law related to the use of oceans and seas. So maritime and admiralty law tends to be domestic, while the law of the sea tends to be the international rules amongst different nations. Now, shipping was incredibly important to the United States when it was a new nation, and that's why.
Just one little note, it's a little bit annoying having that classical music so loud in the background. I really wish she hadn't done that, or at least tuned it down a little bit more. But I actually did know that there were those 3 different areas. I don't know if it's called something different here in Australia. Everything when it comes to the legal system is like similar, but just slightly different. So I don't know if it's still called admiralty law. I don't know if it's still called maritime law over here in Australia. I feel there might just be different terminology on what the actual countries themselves use. I'm not sure if there's different terminology for what Australian law uses. If there's any solicitors or anybody who knows about this, let me know in the comments down below. If there are any solicitors, let me know if you'd like a paralegal who works remotely, because I'm willing to give it a go.
Why it's mentioned several times in the U.S. Constitution. Article 3 defines the boundaries of subject matter jurisdiction for the courts. Specifically, it extends to the judicial power of the United States to, quote, all cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction. And if you're a U.S. lawyer dealing with maritime law, you're probably dealing with laws like the Merchant Marine Act of 1928, also known as the Jones Act. This act gives sailors the right to sue negligent sea captains and companies if they're injured on the seas, and it also highly restricts the type of ships that are allowed to transport goods in the United States. Specifically, the Jones Act says that any ship that transports goods between 2 different U.S. states has to be built in the United States, be owned 75% by U.S. citizens, be crewed at least 75% by U.S. citizens, and fly a U.S. flag. Now,
that list sounds like an absolute headache. We'll go back to that for a second. But obviously flying the US flag really isn't that big of a deal, especially if the ship is owned by 75% US citizens. Built in the US, that's getting a little bit tricky. It feels like the US is building fewer and fewer ships. 75% owned by US citizens and 75% manned by US citizen crew. Ooh, those sound like it'd be a lot tougher to actually like maintain that level. But let's see what else he has to say on this. That sounds like very, very strict rules, and something that for a law that was written back in like 1928, Have they amended it to make it a little bit more feasible, a little bit more reasonable, or do they still have those strict protocols and standards in place?
You're probably thinking, who cares? This is just an esoteric law about ships. But it actually has a huge impact on the US economy. And for you, my fellow US consumer, it can make things incredibly expensive. For example, the cost of shipping one container from Los Angeles to Shanghai is about $900, whereas the cost of shipping that same container from Los Angeles to Hawaii is about $10,000. And as a result, states like Alaska and Hawaii and territories like Puerto Rico have incredibly high shipping rates just to get things from one state to another, whereas those rates often don't apply to foreign countries. And
That's absurd. The fact that Americans have to pay so much more for shipping than what foreigners are having to pay, that's absurd. That's embarrassing, to be honest. And is this something that they've done to address? Are they doing anything to fix this in Congress? I mean, this is a pretty old law and something that should be addressed. At this point, you'd think it would be addressed. Is it really benefiting anybody?
well, you might be thinking, hey, it's good for American shipbuilders and American sailors. Well, there aren't actually that many. US shipbuilding basically doesn't exist anymore outside of the defense industry. There are less than 100 ships that meet the requirements of the Jones Act. So in times of emergency, sometimes these states are just completely screwed.
Less than 100 ships in all of the US are able to meet that requirement. Okay, just out of curiosity, let's see if we can find this on a quick Google search. How many destroyers does the US have? There are 72 destroyers and 17 cruisers in the US Navy. There are 99 destroyers and cruisers in the US Navy. Those are only two types of ships. There's a lot of different kinds of ships in the Navy. There are only less than 100 ships that meet this Jones Act requirement. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. How is this not changed? How is this still a thing?
This might be the dumbest law on the books. It's enough to drive you to piracy, which is what we're going to talk about next. So it might not surprise you to learn that if you commit the act of piracy on the high seas, you can be prosecuted as such. And during the golden age of piracy, there were thousands and thousands of pirates operating in the Caribbean and off the Barbary Coast, which had a huge effect on the formation of this nation. In the Caribbean, they boarded merchant ships from Britain, the Netherlands, France, and Portugal and played big powers against each other. Some of their exploits are legendary. Blackbeard captured a former slave ship named the Concord, renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, and blockaded Charleston Harbor in 1718. Piracy was such a menace that it made its way into the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10 gives Congress the power to, quote, define and punish piracy and felonies on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations.
Go and ask some of the crazy, constitution-loving, I love this word, nut jobs over in the States, and ask if they knew that piracy was part of the Constitution. I had no idea. I even took classes in law school, and I had no idea that piracy was part of the Constitution.
And in 1790, Congress used that authorization to create the first Anti-Piracy Act. And this had nothing to do with software. It was about actual sea pirates. The statute defined piracy as murder or robbery on the high seas, or any other crime committed on the high seas that would be punishable by death under U.S. law if committed on land. The Supreme Court held that the 1790 statute was limited in its scope, and American courts couldn't penalize people who committed piracy if they weren't American citizens sailing on a U.S. flagged vessel, or if they didn't inflict actual harm on U.S. citizens. Congress eventually amended the law in 1819, specifying that piracy didn't need a specific nexus to the United States. That's actually very rare in law, because if you have watched this channel before, you know that standing is an incredibly important requirement for almost any US lawsuit or prosecution. However, rather than defining what piracy meant, as it did in the original statute, it referred to the crime of piracy as defined by the law of nations. The punishment for piracy under the 1890 law was death. In 1909, the penalty was changed to life imprisonment. And the 1909 law hasn't been amended since its passage, and it's found at 18 U.S.C. 1651. But the first challenge to the 1819 law came swiftly in 1820, when a man named Smith participated in a mutiny on a private vessel commissioned by the colony of Buenos Aires. Smith and his mates imprisoned the captain, seized another pirate ship called the Irresistible, and robbed a Spanish vessel. Smith was convicted of piracy, but he took his conviction to the Supreme Court. Smith argued that the definition of piracy was too vague, but the court disagreed. The Supreme Court held that piracy was defined with reasonable certainty by the law of nations and that robbery on the high seas was a component of piracy.
Yeah, so that one does seem pretty obvious. There are some people who will try to argue about the terms and the definitions, especially if it's something that hasn't been challenged before. Like if this was the first case where the term piracy was actually challenged, I can see that going all the way up to the Supreme Court. But if there's a pretty clear definition of it, particularly in this law of nations that it keeps referring to, which I'm not entirely sure what that is, I've actually never heard of it before this video, then clearly there is some sort of definition. Sometimes you just really don't know how much of a defense, so you'll throw anything at the wall to make it stick.
Now, nations hate piracy and they hate pirates, which is why they want to prosecute pirates whenever they can. So the US and many other developed countries have taken a universal approach to this kind of law. This kind of international law is actually very rare, but it did serve as a template for the prosecutions in Nuremberg and Tokyo following World War II. Now, it took 200 years for the US to prosecute another case of piracy, but in 2010, the US actually prosecuted 2 different cases of piracy. The first, US versus Sade, involved pirates who shot at the USS Ashland. The pirates boarded a small skiff and fired weapons at the Ashland, but didn't attempt to board. The pirates moved to dismiss the case since they didn't board or take control of the USS Ashland. And the US District Court granted the motion. The court said that the piracy statute only allowed prosecutions for, quote, robbery or forcible depredations upon the sea, the definition given to piracy by the United States Supreme Court in Smith 190 years earlier. But in the sister case in US versus Hassan, the Fourth Circuit expanded the definition of piracy beyond just robbery. In that case, Somali pirates mistakenly thought a US military vessel, the USS Nicholas, was actually a merchant ship. The pirates opened fire on the ship and the USS Nicholas crew fired back. The pirates agreed to flee, but they were captured and brought to the US, where they became the first men convicted of piracy in 200 years. Wow. They were given life sentences. However, the men thought that they could appeal based on the Sade case. They had not boarded the USS Nicholas, nor did they rob the vessel. Unfortunately for them, the Fourth Circuit expanded the definition of robbery and upheld the convictions. The court held that when Congress enacted 18 U.S.C. 1651 and provided for piracy to be defined by the law of nations, Congress knew that the definition of piracy would expand and evolve as the law of nations evolved. The court noted that the international definition of piracy has included many actions beyond robbery and murder. The Fourth Circuit held that limiting the definition of piracy to robbery on the high seas would, quote, render it incongruous with the modern law of nations and prevent the federal courts from exercising universal jurisdiction in piracy cases.
I also remember when piracy itself was first about. Think about the technology that existed. Think about the Jones Act 1928. Think about the technologies that existed, particularly the technology you could bring onto ships, and then compare that to the technology we have in this day and age. The types of guns that exist, the drones that exist, the missiles, the weapons that exist, very, very different. And clearly it's something that does adapt over time, but it normally does take a case like the first case with the Somali pirates to actually enact this sort of change. So that is typically the way that laws and whatnot evolve over in the States, is you have somebody who ends up basically falling under the old statutes, the old limitations, the old laws, and then that enacts a reason for them to amend or change laws, typically.
The Fourth Circuit reversed the dismissal of the piracy count in Sade. The bottom line is that under modern US law, piracy on the high seas involves things other than just robbery. So pirates, be prepared to walk the plank. And at this point, we're pretty good at prosecuting pirates. America kicking pirates' ass since 1801, with, I guess, a few exceptions to that rule.
Funny how piracy isn't really something that people tend to think of every day, but there are definitely laws around it. I'm sure Australia has its own laws as well. It's probably very much in a similar scope to the laws that exist in the States, obviously. Not exact laws, it's not going to be exactly the same, but I have a feeling that it is fairly similar, particularly with this law of nations. Whether that, I think he said it came about in 1905, so Australia was already a federation for about 4 years, so they probably adapted it around that time, or even prior laws, it would have been adapted through the UK since it was part of the Commonwealth. But I'm sure Australian law has laws regarding piracy as well. It's one of those instances where things are similar, just a little bit different between the two countries. So that's it for this video, you guys. I hope you guys liked it. If you did, please hit the like and subscribe button down below. Let me know what you guys think of this video. Let me know what you thought of Legal Eagle's videos, and if you've seen any others, because he does some really well done, in-depth research videos, you guys. He has a great channel. Definitely go pop over there. Not only just American law, but you will learn quite a bit over there. He's actually quite entertaining, I gotta be honest. So that's it for this video, you guys, and I will see you in the next one.